Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Fresh Perspectives. I'm James Zervios, Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Obesity Action Coalition. Today, we're talking about weight bias, how people are perceived, and how it continues to shape the way society treats individuals living with obesity. Weight bias means unfair treatment or negative attitudes towards someone because of their size, and it shows up everywhere in the media, in schools, at work, at home, and even in healthcare. We all know and love a John Candy film. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Uncle Buck, Home Alone, Spaceballs, my personal favorite, The Great Outdoors. The list goes on and on. His humor, warmth, and heart made him one of the most beloved actors of his time. A new documentary called John Candy, I Like Me, celebrates his incredible talent, but also reveals how often he faced weight bias throughout his career. Much of the attention focused on his body size rather than his work, with interviewers asking about his weight instead of his craft. And that focus followed him everywhere. You can find the documentary streaming now on Amazon Prime. And to talk more about how we can change that story, I'm joined by OAC community members Jess Perreca, Sarah Bramblette, and Ian Patton, who all have lived experience and insights to share about weight bias. Thank you all for being here. Ian, I want to give you the first question in this fresh perspective. In the John Candy I Like Me documentary, we see how often John Candy's weight became the focus instead of his talent. Why do you think people still have such a hard time seeing beyond the weight and really just looking at him for that specifically?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think there's a couple things that go into it, but I think a lot of it has to do with it just being ingrained in society that it's acceptable, that that people can treat people living in larger bodies with, with that biased kind of approach, that we can make fun of people, that they can be the brunt of the jokes, and that they're okay, they can handle it. You can see it in the interviews that they did with him, where they were like just bringing it up and asking so bluntly hurtful questions about his size. And it's just, it felt almost like it was okay to do that. And I watch it now and I can't believe that that was okay. So it's just kind of ingrained in society. It's definitely something that we learn from early on as kids, that we can make fun of people that are bigger and look like John or myself, and a lot of us have experienced that.
Now, Ian, I think you bring up some great points there. I saw the documentary, and here they are interviewing him, kind of the height of the career. He's in all of these amazing movies. And then out of the blue, there's just this question about his weight. So you're absolutely right. It really does sort of kind of focus, laser focus in on that. Meanwhile, there were so many other amazing things they could have been talking to him about. Sarah, my next question is for you. So, what are some ways that weight bias shows up in everyday life? Think about this maybe at work, at school, at home, or even in doctor's visits that people might not even realize. And we know that weight bias is very, very prevalent in healthcare.
Yeah, I think weight bias shows up in the fact that people assume they know what you're doing or they know what your problem is based on our appearance, because they think obviously we're eating too much, we're not being active enough, and that's the cause of obesity. And I think that's the only issue, social issue someone might have that shows up physically, even though we know that's not what's showing up physically. A disease is showing up physically, not, our lifestyle. But people look at you and they assume you're not taking care of yourself. You're not educated enough to do what you're doing. And that is, I think, most harmful in healthcare, because the doctors think they just assume you don't care about your health. And it kind of marks you as non-compliant sometimes, or they just think you need to do other things to fix all your healthcare issues, even though, we know that we can have some relatively healthy aspects to our bodies, and weight isn't an indicator of that overall health. Um, my thing is, sometimes just out in public, I get approached by people who want to help me or save me or offer advice to me, and I'm just trying to live my life, and they think I'm sad, I'm upset, and like pity me, and I'm just trying to like do my grocery shopping. And then when I get upset about it, they think, oh, there it is. She is upset, but I just want to live my life. That's what I'm doing. And it is hard because people see me and have these assumptions thinking they know what I'm doing or knowing what my lived experience is. And they don't. I'm just a regular human.
Yeah, Sarah, I think you hit on a point that I feel like is going to be echoed throughout this fresh perspective, and Ian touched on this too, of just this level of assumption. And what I will say is like okayness, right? To bring up the topic of weight with somebody unsolicited, right? And I think that's seems to be the one of the common themes here around this documentary, and then even what people still deal with weight bias today. Jess, my next question for you: do you think the media has gotten any better at showing people with obesity fairly, or are there some old stereotypes that still show up in new ways?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And, I think that from everything, the perspective that the media gives is they really only focus on the before and the after. They never really hone in on what it really took for a lot of us to, get to the after or even the during. And that's a big part of it too. There's always that just main focus on where you were at the very worst and the success story, because that's what in the news is exciting. But the hard work that we do in between those two periods is what really needs to be more focused on, I think.
Jess, I couldn't agree with you more on that. In fact, I think so often in this in society and media, we kind of see this snapshot of before and after, but we don't, to your point, see everything that happened in between. And while that may not be as overt as a news reporter asking John Candy directly about his weight in the middle of an interview, it still does perpetuate that stigma. So excellent point with that. John Candy deserved to be remembered for his kindness and creativity, not his size. What gives you hope that things are changing, and what can all of us do to help make that happen? And I put that out to the three of you. Ian, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, I think, well, to kind of build off that point that we were just talking about, I think, avoid talking about people's bodies, right? Like it just shouldn't be normalized that it's okay to make comments on anyone's bodies, but especially people living in larger bodies. There's so much more to people, and I think if we start, you know, pushing back on that a little bit and expecting that the norm is that, we can treat each other with some dignity and respect, that would be a good place to start. And I think we're starting to see more of that more and more now, which is exciting. I start to see a lot of good conversations happening, either like when I get interviewed for media stuff now, or just out in the community. I'm seeing more people having more appropriate conversations. But I think more of it needs to happen.
Sarah, what are your thoughts?
I think back to when I see a story about obesity or a certain celebrity. It's interesting. We typically say don't read the comments, but I read the comments now because I can't help it. And there's actually a shift in comments. People do get it. I see more people defending people and saying it's none of their business or we shouldn't judge them based on that. And it's their life. I actually just saw a comedian talk about like maybe my audience likes me at my size, but I'm doing this for my health. And so, if I lose, fans because of it, at least I'm around for the rest of the fans. And I think that's kind of the shift in understanding. And what I loved about the documentary was they focused on the human side of him. And that's what I think sometimes is the hardest thing that I want to portray is people see me as a human being, just like they are. And I know they couldn't have done the documentary without touching on the topic, and I just really appreciated Ryan Reynolds and the job he did in this. It really was a project of love, as they said. Like he was a big fan, and listening, having his family involved and his friends, and it really I think that the final one of the final comments about like live your life so they close a highway for your funeral procession, like that, like really showed how much he was loved by the fans and by his country.
Jess, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just think, it's important to, realize that um, it's more of an unfortunate situation when the focus is more on someone's size than the talents and what they offered in, their career and what they gave us. And I think that was a lot of what, I took from, the documentary is, you know, here's an individual that just poured his life out there to make us all, laugh. And I think sometimes you can mask and disguise a lot. And I know this just from personal experience, just even myself, just trying to be the funny guy to mask and throw away, you know, being that person of size. But I think there's much more to me and to us than, our size alone. And I think there's, when you have something to offer, I wish that the focus was more, laid out on that than our size.
So one final question for all of you, and this might be the most fun question in this very difficult topic. What is your favorite John Candy movie? And Jess, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I would say it's a classic, and they're talking about bringing it back, and that's got to be Spaceballs. So yeah, I mean that one is, every time it comes on, I'll even find myself every once in a while, usually about every other year, and that, when it's on, I catch it, and whatever point that it's at, and I'm watching it. But just a classic, and just a classic that if they do bring it back, and somehow I just hope, whether it's CGI or whatever, that they find some way to include him somehow.
Love it. I always feel like it's a good holiday movie. I see you have your tree up there in the
Yes.
background and you find it on TV, and to your point, whatever spot it's at, you just got to finish it and watch it. So I agree. Sarah, how about you? What's your favorite John Candy film?
I have to admit, so I was feeling very nostalgic and watching the preview of even just the documentary, and I went and watched a whole bunch of old John Candy movies, and I have to say, Uncle Buck. I think just what he does to the oldest child, the following her to a party and busting it, like that. Just it's kind of how I was raised too, and then to hear the documentary say that part was kind of created for him, and I think it really reflects how much John Candy cared for everyone in his life, and it's kind of sad. I mean, we saw he did have many friends and family who loved him, but kind of how like those reporters in society still couldn't get past. He's a great guy, a great actor, a loving human being, but oh, what about your weight? And that's just the sting of it that I really hope people can get past.
Very good points. Last but not least, Ian, how about you?
Yeah, well, the two really good answers there already. So I've on the fly been trying to change my answer. I probably saw Uncle Buck more than any of the other movies. Spaceballs is an absolute favorite of mine. I would say as an adult, though, now that I've gone back and seen some things, I didn't watch Planes, Trains, and Automobiles when I was younger. But I've watched it as an adult, and that has to be my favorite. And then there's always the Canadian plug for Canadian Bacon, which is also a great movie.
I would agree with all three of you. Mine that I think just sticks with me from childhood was The Great Outdoors. I think that was, he was the ultimate dad, family man, and to your point, Sarah, in the documentary, they talk about, even though they were roles written for him, it was really him. That's who that was on screen, right? And so he always looked out for everybody. He always wanted to be the most amazing dad. I mean, you even hear his children reference that in the documentary of just how he cared for others. So all great choices. I encourage anyone watching this Fresh Perspective to find these on Amazon or whatever streaming service you want and check them all out. Well, look, I want to thank all of you for sharing your experiences and thoughts today. John Candy's story reminds us that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. His life and legacy challenge us to think about how we talk about our weight, how we portray it in the media, and how we treat people in everyday life. Weight bias doesn't just hurt feelings. It limits opportunity, affects access to care, and impacts health and well-being. Changing that starts with awareness, compassion, and education. We all have a role to play, rethinking the words we use, the assumptions we make, and the stories we tell. If you'd like to learn more about weight bias and how to take action, visit OAC's Stop Weight Bias campaign at stopweightbias.com. There you'll find tools, resources, and ways to get involved. Thank you for watching this episode of Fresh Perspectives. Please continue the conversation on our social media pages, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.